Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. I'm your host, Lucas Draga, Solution Specialist here at AgilePoint, and thank you so much for joining me today. Now we're still seeing a few of your colleagues dialing in here, so let's give them another moment or so before we go ahead and get started. All right, it looks like everyone's more or less settled in, so why don't we get started? Before we do that, just a few quick housekeeping items. As you've probably noticed, this is a webinar session, and as such, your lines have been muted. Now, as always, we do want to encourage interaction, and the best way to do that is using the questions panel in your Zoom console. If we don't get a chance to answer your question throughout the course of the webinar today, we have a few moments set aside at the end to go over questions as a group. Now we've got a great agenda for you today. We're very excited to share with you all that our product team has been up to over the past few months. So during this session, we'll share with you all of the new capabilities released in Software Update 2 of AgilePoint version 7. This release is packed with a number of new features, deeper support for existing features, as well as usability enhancements. So over the course of the session today, we'll introduce you to some of the highlights in our latest release, and at the end, we'll go through a quick demo of some of those features. So we're going to start off today with one of the features that has been most requested among our customer base, and that is webhooks. Now, I'm sure that most of you are aware of what webhooks bring to the table, but just so that we're all on the same page, this is a way of connecting two systems together when something happens. Based on some event, we can gain instant access to new data and status information. And for those of you who have been leveraging AgilePoint on premises or in a private cloud, you're probably already familiar with this sort of functionality to some degree. For quite some time now, AgilePoint has had a capability called Agile Connector, which delivers this same sort of functionality, and we've now extended this functionality to the public cloud with the introduction of webhooks. Now, for those of you who are wondering, when would I use each? There's a pretty simple way to go about making that decision. If you do have this sort of server-level access, as you would see in private cloud or on-premises deployment, and have access to .NET developer skills, continue to use the Agile Connector. It's the preferred method in these sorts of scenarios because it runs in the context of the AgilePoint server. And on the other hand, if you don't have access to .NET developers, or you're in the on-demand or shared public cloud, feel free to leverage the new webhooks functionality. And we'll go through a demo of this a little bit later on in today's session. Now, the next major components that I'd like to speak to today are around Form Designer enhancements. For those of you who are on version 7, you're probably familiar with the concept of selecting a primary data source. This is primarily attractive to a less technical designer because it gives us the ability to automate a large chunk of our form design around an existing data source. Using this feature, I can select a primary database table, add secondary and tertiary data sources, and automate the application design around that data source. Now, up until SU2, we had support for SQL Server, SharePoint lists, Salesforce, and various databases. With this recent release, we've broadened that support to include support for MySQL. And again, you'll see an example of this a little bit later on in the presentation. The other form design enhancements really have to do with managing look and feel. And the next piece that I'd like to talk about today is the inclusion of an out-of-the-box theme available in AgilePoint's marketplace. Again, you'll see this a little later on during the presentation, but as you can see here, we have a out-of-the-box theme with JavaScript and CSS pre-applied. So for those of you who don't have access to designer skill sets, you can now have a beautiful look and feel for all of your forms. And then working side by side with this theme functionality is the concept of global CSS. For those of you who have been with AgilePoint for some time now, you know that styling is managed on an individual application basis, where I can have different look and feel for different applications or also forms within an application. With Software Update 2, we've introduced the concept of global CSS, which means that all of our applications can have uniform look and feel automatically. We can centrally apply our style sheets and ensure that all applications going forward, as well as all applications previously created, have the same look and feel. Next, this brings us to Process Designer enhancements. And the first piece that I'd like to talk about today is a new integration. Now, for those of you who are following the robotic process automation market, you're probably well aware that Blue Prism is one of the market leaders. And with the introduction of this Blue Prism connector, AgilePoint now provides great coverage across the market-leading RPA solutions, adding to our previous support for UiPath. And as is the case with every release, we're expanding and deepening our support for existing integrations. As you're seeing on screen here, this software update brings us expanded support for Google Drive, Twilio, AgilePoint's own built-in data modeler, Data Entity, Slack, Excel, UiPath, and Azure AD. And I'd like to take a second to speak to a few of these because I do feel that they are really groundbreaking additions to these integrations. We'll start off with Excel. And just as a quick refresher, what this does is it gives us the ability to read or write to Excel spreadsheets. Now, previously, this was on an individual row basis within a spreadsheet. With the Software Update 2 release, this brings in support for repeating rows, giving us the ability to read or write multiple rows within an Excel spreadsheet. And probably one of the most exciting additions to Software Update 2 from a process design perspective is the expanded support for UiPath. Now, you've probably seen in the past, up until this point, we had the ability to pass application data from an AgilePoint process over to a software robot, unifying how humans and robots can work together. With Software Update 2, we've added a number of new activities, including the ability to check a job status, as well as the status of a queue item for UiPath. Now, the reason that this is particularly important is it gives us an ability to address one of the major shortcomings that lots of RPA customers see with their robot deployment. The intent of RPA is to augment a human workforce and to remove manual or data entry tasks from human workers and to take that over by the robot. Which sounds great in practice, but the reality of RPA is that this sort of UI level integration is oftentimes very brittle and prone to breakage, often resulting in an exception for our robot. With the introduction of checking job and queue item status, AgilePoint can now understand when a robot has reached a defaulted state, giving the ability for a human task to be created to rectify the issue. This should go a long way in making RPA solutions much more scalable, right, by automating the exception handling capabilities through a combination of UiPath and AgilePoint. Now, the next feature that I'd like to talk about today was, up until this point, a premium add-on feature that was only unlocked via services. And that is the ability to create custom columns and custom tabs in our Work Center. So as you're seeing on screen here, I have the default Work Center experience with my default tabs. And as you can see here, in my next screenshot, I've opened up a custom tab for a specific high-valued process, in this case, employee onboarding, and within that tab, have opened up additional columns. Now this was created for a POC, a customer who had an employee onboarding use case, which is why we have additional columns for candidate and their job application status, but this could easily surface any application data captured by AgilePoint. In the case of an invoice processing use case, I might be surfacing the invoice amount and to whom the invoice is paid. And the best part about this is that this sort of customization and extension of the Work Center can easily be implemented by any user, provided they have the permission. This is all driven via configuration, and not a single line of code was required. And we'll see this a little bit later on during the demo. Next, this brings us to the Manage Center. And we've already talked about one of the most groundbreaking Manage Center enhancements, which was the ability to create webhooks. But the next major feature within the Manage Center here is around session management. And this gives me an ability to monitor all active sessions, successes, and failures within a given period. Okay, so the next piece that I'd like to talk about today is the addition of an AgilePoint application in the UiPath Go store, which is UiPath's marketplace. So as we mentioned previously, right, we've long had the ability to pass application data over to a software robot and to initiate a robot job. With the introduction of the app in the UiPath Go store, we can now facilitate bidirectional data sync, giving UiPath the ability to pass data and initiate a new AgilePoint process instance. This is a free component, so if you're a UiPath customer, head on over to the UiPath store and get this new component. Now, SU2 wouldn't be complete without enhancements to the page builder. This has really been one of the most exciting additions to the AgilePoint platform over the last few years, because it gives the ability to easily customize the AgilePoint portal. Now, this is something that we've had in the product for some time, but up until this point, relied heavily on CSS and HTML skill sets. The intent here with the page builder is to give non-designers the ability to create stunning pages via drag and drop. So in an effort to give our customers a sense of what's possible with the page builder, we've included a number of out-of-the-box templates and a few usability improvements that we'll talk about in the next slide. So we have a few examples here from major industries and functional areas, things like finance, healthcare, logistics, pharmaceuticals, and many others. We'll walk through a few of those examples a little bit later on. Now, as far as the page builder enhancements are concerned, these are all primarily usability related features. The first of which is the ability to easily import and export pages with all dependencies included. Right, the reason that this is important is as we're moving our pages from our pre-production into production environments, it required a number of manual steps. We had to import the page as well as the CSS and any other dependencies. So that's all nicely been tightened up. Whenever I import a page or export a page, all of the related elements will move with that page. In addition, we can easily clone a control of a page, as well as copy and paste formatting from one control to another. And then lastly, in an effort to better manage the image assets that we use across all of our pages, we've now released an asset library. Okay, so that covers the features that I wanted to introduce. Let's jump into a demo and see some of these features in action. Okay, so the first feature that I'm going to highlight here is around the creation of custom columns and tabs. Now again, this is a great feature that enables the users to personalize their dashboard experience, and to do so solely via configuration. No code required whatsoever. So as you can see here, I have a tab for employee onboarding. And when I click into that tab, I have 2 additional columns surfacing additional application data. So this is the experience for the end user. Let's quickly walk through how we get to that point. So as you can see here in my next tab, I have navigated over to the Settings module, and then we'll click on the Work Center settings. So here I have an option for tab settings. And if I scroll down, you'll see I have a section for custom tab configuration. Now, keep in mind that while this has been released in Software Update 2, this is a public cloud only feature for this point. We'll be releasing support for private cloud and on-premises in the coming months. So as you can see here, there are some basic settings that I need to configure, the name of my tab, as well as which process I'll show in this tab. Now I could easily have added multiple processes, but in this case, I have a dedicated tab solely for my onboarding process. This custom tab is going to serve as an extension of my tasks. And as you can see here, I have some additional configuration options, making this a default tab, as well as enabling dynamic loading. Now below here, I'm showing the 2 columns and the application data that I'd like to expose to my end user. So as you can see here, I have a data path, right? We call this the X path. I can specify width and the positioning and whether it's visible to the end user. So how did we get this value? Well, to show you that, I'm going to navigate over to my application designer here. And under form data, you can see that I have a few fields called candidate name and application status. So if I click on one of these fields here, I'll get that XPath. And then I would paste that into my custom data path field. Now you'll notice here that I've removed some of the AgilePoint syntax so that I'm just showing the form field value. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, if you're using data-bound fields, right, whether this is for AgilePoint's data entity or a data-bound field with a database or Salesforce as an example, you will need to have an additional hidden form field, right, that will capture this value, right, because as of today, this functionality does not yet support data-bound fields. So for any important fields here, simply create an additional hidden field, capture that data value from the form, and then input the XPath. Okay, so next I'll want to go through the new page options here. So the first thing that we'll want to do is we'll want to enable the sample pages. So to do that, I would go over to my App Designer settings, navigate over to Build Pages, and as you can see here, I have a checkbox to enable the sample pages. So once that's been checked, we can head on over to Build Pages. And as you can see here, I have a folder for sample pages. So this will give us access to all of the sample pages that we showed earlier in the PowerPoint slides. I can easily preview. I can copy the format or clone the control as we highlighted earlier, giving us a much better ability to copy look and feel elements between one page to another or among the same page. So feel free to explore these. There's a number of great options that come off the shelf with AgilePoint now, giving you a great sense of the level of control and what potential pages can look like using the page builder. Okay, so next we'll go through webhooks. So to get to webhooks, I'm going to go over to the Manage Center. And at the bottom here, you'll see that I have a section for webhooks. Now, as we mentioned, this is a great way to tie two systems together, right? It's much more efficient rather than polling an API at regular intervals. So as you can see here, I'll simply click Create a Webhook. I would give my webhook a name, as well as the notification URL, and then the type of event where I'd like to trigger the data flow. So as you can see here, there are two major categories. One is around workflow or instance-based events. So when a process is started, as an example, or perhaps when one is completed. If you follow our architect Nishant's blog, you may have seen the completed instance used in the past, where at the completion of an invoice processing application, we send a message to another website, perhaps one that tracks the number of invoices and the amount of those invoices that we've processed within a given period. In addition to workflow and instance-based, there is also access control-based webhooks, and this has to do with changes around users, groups, and roles. Okay, so for the final demo for this webinar, I'm going to show you the capability of building an application around MySQL, leveraging it as a primary data source. So to do that, I'm going to click on Add an App. This will work for both process as well as form-based applications, but for today, I'm going to select a form-based app. Now, you may have seen this screen already, but if I click on Database here, I'll be able to select my access token for my MySQL database. There we go. And I'm going to select my primary entity of customer. As you can see here, I have another table, but this is a child of my parent customer table. So from here, I'm going to select all of the fields that I'd like to use, and optionally, I can unselect certain fields if I don't need them. And then I'll bring along my child table. So what this will do here is it's going to drop me into the Form Designer. For those of you who are not familiar with form-based applications, AgilePoint has pre-created a lot of components on my behalf. As you can see here, we have two blank forms called New Customer and Update Customer, a view to see all of the records, and then a lookup for each of those views. Now, I won't spend much time making this form visually appealing, but I do want to highlight just how much this capability here will enable a less technical designer to contribute to more of the application design process. So as you can see here, I have a number of fields in my data model on the left-hand side. And AgilePoint is going to suggest the appropriate controls to use for this data. Bring in their email. Phone number. And just to show you the level of intelligence brought in here, I'm going to drop this child table on my form. Now, AgilePoint understands that this is going to be a repeating section, so as a result, gives me a different set of options between a subform, data grid, or a comments control. Now in this case here, I'll go with a subform and just drag this across to take up all of the available real estate. And now I can begin designing my subform, following the same process that we showed just a moment ago. Now optionally, I could do some calculation, get some totals here, but just for the sake of demonstration, we'll keep it straightforward. So in just a matter of moments, I've created my form. As you can see here with my database icon, these are instantly data-bound fields. So as a less technical designer, I don't need to worry about manually pushing data to a database via a process step, and just makes the entire design process a lot easier. Now as an added bonus here, I'm going to highlight the global CSS capability. As you can see here, this is a very standard out-of-the-box form, but if I bring this up in preview, we'll see that my out-of-the-box theme and global CSS has been applied. Okay, so that concludes the demo portion for today. Let's take some Q&A. So the first question that I'm seeing here is, do we have any support for Azure Blob Storage? That's a great question. Nothing that's out of the box currently. That being said, there are a number of ways that we could interact with that service. So as you may know, we do have a generic REST connector, which is going to be great for developers, but probably less friendly for a business analyst or less technical sort of designer. So in that sort of scenario, if you do have access to the SDK, I would recommend creating a reusable integration for that service. That would be a one-time development exercise, which in turn would yield a configurable and reusable activity similar to all of the other 70 that AgilePoint supports off the shelf. That's a great question. I'm seeing another question here about mobile configuration via QR code. Absolutely, that is included in the product. It's a great way to get new users immediately configured with the mobile app. Previously, this was managed on an individual basis where users would need to understand things like portal URL, which is not very friendly to the average business user. So this is now something that you can configure once, and via the user settings page, can easily take a picture of that barcode and instantly configure your mobile device. Great question. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions for the moment. There are a few that we'll follow up offline about, but if anyone has any other questions, we're going to leave the line open for another moment or so here. But in the interim, I did want to point out that there are a couple of resources where you can learn lots more about what's included in this release, as well as view specific videos for the different pieces of functionality. So the first of which is a great resource, AgilePoint NX blog. This is a product blog from our architect, Nishant Srivastava. Great detail in recently released features, as well as addressing some of the more advanced scenarios that you might see in your use of AgilePoint. And the next being, of course, our documentation site. You can see the full release notes there, as well as the documentation for all of the new features that you learned about today. And I do see one more question here from David Hill, which is regarding timeline for the availability of custom columns and tabs for on-premises. Unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you today, David. I do know that it's something that the product team is looking to release in the next coming months, but as of now, we do not have a firm release date. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for your questions and your engagement. It's been a great session as always. We're looking forward to seeing you on the next one.
Until next time.